All right, so I think we've given people a couple extra minutes to come in. Let's get started. My name is Liam Newman, also known as Bitwise Man on IRC and on on GitHub and the Gitter channels and so on. And I'm going to talk to you about concise pipelines with shared libraries. This is me. I work at CloudBees. I'm a Jenkins technical evangelist, contributor to Jenkins, number of plugins, CI/CD advocate, and generally an expert on pipeline. So now we're going to talk about concise during this talk, but it's easier to start by looking at what isn't concise, and we all know what it looks like when you are not concise, what lacks clarity. This is too long. This is one of the quotes from Monty Python, where the headmaster is giving instructions to people, and all of the students, their eyes just glaze over, and they can't tell what to do. On the other end of the spectrum, this is also not concise. This is way too short, and everyone here has a delivery pipeline. You're all delivering software all the time, either continuously or via people walking floppy disks around. Yes, I just said floppy disks. Okay. But whatever your process is, this would be too short, because someone looks at this and it says, go what? Go blow up the building? Go delete all of the source code? But what's going to happen when I push that button? And they don't know, and they can't be confident about what's going to happen when they push that button. And that's part of what needs to happen. So in this talk, we're going to look at pipelines and look at Jenkins files, give examples of what's too long, what's too short, have some opinion about what's just right. I'll give you an introduction on how to set up shared libraries and what they are. We'll look at some examples, both mine and in the real world, and talk about some concerns, and I'll give a couple final recommendations. So I'm assuming that everyone knows what pipeline is, that you've at least looked at both scripted and declarative pipeline, and so you know what Jenkins is at this point, right? It'd be hard to know what Jenkins is at this point without having seen or heard of pipeline. And when you write a pipeline for your project, you put it in a Jenkins file, and so pipeline is very powerful, and with great power comes great responsibility to your team and to helping them understand what's going on when they hit that red button, right? So this is not responsible. This is someone being mean and saying, I know how to code, I know how to write Groovy, and I wonder if you can read this, but I'm not worried about it. This is not responsible to your team. This is not being nice to them. Because now, if they don't know Groovy, if they don't understand this, if they don't already have a sense of this, they're going to be very confused when they look at, if this is how your Jenkins file starts, they're going to immediately run away. I've been the guy that wrote this kind of code before, and my developers very kindly informed me that this was not okay. They did it by saying that Groovy is too complex. They did it by saying a lot of different things, but what they meant was, you, speaking to me, you have not made it possible for me to understand what's going on in the delivery pipeline. This is the other end of the spectrum, and it is possible to do this in CloudBees, using the CloudBees core offering. You can actually have a blank Jenkins file, and it will run whatever your delivery pipeline is on the specified in templates and other things. But this is also not nice. This is not how you communicate what's going to happen when people say, "Go, please deliver my software." You can have a one-line file, and it can also be without CloudBees, and you'll end up with the same problem, because people will say, "Well, what does this do?" Well, it delivers your software. Where? What does it do on the way there? So this is too short. So before we get into actually showing what I think is just right. Let's try and agree on what we would describe as just right. I like to use the word concise because it means as short and as you can reasonably make something while still being clear. And ultimately, the point of this just right target that we're trying to hit, this balance, is sort of at the core of the DevOps philosophy, which is to democratize your delivery process. You get everyone involved from end to end in the software delivery process, from the creation right out until you hit production. And for Jenkins' part in that, the Jenkins file is the description of that process. And so what you're shooting for is something that everyone, and by everyone I mean everyone on your team, such as both developers, testers, managers, anyone who's involved in the process can look at that and understand what is going to happen in that pipeline. One of the things that helps us make Jenkins files and Jenkins Pipeline concise is shared libraries. At their most basic, shared libraries are a layer of abstraction. They let us take common functions or more complex logic and create custom steps that contain that logic. And so we can use them without necessarily having to stuff all of that code directly into the Jenkins file. They also, in larger organizations, you can use them to share common logic across multiple projects. That's, of course, in the name shared, right? But the thing that I most often have to tell people when they say, oh, well, we don't use shared libraries because we don't need to share the code across multiple projects. I'm like, no. Yeah, I know that the name shared is actually a little misleading. The point is also to allow you to have that layer of abstraction, those custom steps that make it so that your pipeline itself is clearer. Shared libraries are, when you create one, they're stored in a separate repository from your main software project, and they require some setup. This can be done via configuration as code or via the Jenkins UI, which I'm showing here. And this allows the Jenkins administrator to control what repository, where the shared libraries for your pipelines are coming from. So without this, if we just let people pull from anywhere, it'd be a serious security problem. And as it is, this lets the Jenkins administrator would set up the shared libraries to have a name that points to a specific repository that then people can that the pipelines on that, either on the server as a whole or within that particular folder, can use. So let's look at some examples. Okay, let's see. I'm going to switch to, there it is. So this is a simple Jenkins file. It builds a Ruby project. This is a declarative pipeline. And you can tell that from the start because it has the pipeline. Actually, let me make this bigger. The rule, by the way, for when you're presenting is you make it big until it feels like it's just slightly too big, and then that's probably the right spot. So everyone can see this? Yeah, good, okay. So this is a declarative pipeline. It is using the libraries directive and specifies a shared library and the branch of that shared library that it's going to pull from. Now, I haven't looked at this particular shared library, this particular pipeline in quite a while, so I know that it does something. Oh, look, it's using an agent. It's using Docker. That image, it's going to use a Docker image that is going to be Ruby 2.3. So right off the bat, you can see how declarative pipeline, even if I don't really know, I don't know Groovy, I don't know the syntax, I can sort of follow along. This is an outline that makes sense, basically. I'm going to have some options. I don't know what a build discarder is, but maybe I don't need to worry about that. Let's keep going. So stages, okay, I'm going to have a start stage, and during that stage there are some steps. it has one step that's going to send notifications, and something about it's going to send it started probably. I don't know where it's going to send it, but as someone who doesn't know a lot about Jenkins or doesn't know a lot about pipelines, if I were new person on the team, I could follow through and understand what's going on here. Even if I don't understand Groovy, I don't have a lot of development experience, I can walk through this. And this is where declarative pipelines really shine, right? This is that democratization that I was talking about. So this goes on for a while. Obviously, this is a somewhat longer, actually it's not a super long pipeline when you look at it. Sorry, I'm scrolling around a lot. This is going to build a Ruby project, bundle it, archive it, run some tests, publish an HTML report, and then, so that's a post step on the test stage, okay. So after running tests, it'll publish a report, and then at the end of the pipeline, it will always send a notification of the current build result. Okay, so now this particular step right here is the interesting one for me, because this looks like any other step, but this is actually a step from my shared library that I included at the top of the file. Anyone who already knows declarative would be like, what's that? Or already knows the set of steps that pipelines generally have. They'd go, wait, I don't know that one. Where did that come from? So that particular step comes from this shared library that I have, that I had set up on my machine. And now here is the code of that step. And as you can see, this is quite a bit more complex. There's a lot of this. Now we're back to that Groovy code that's like, oh, okay, well maybe I didn't need to know this. If I'm new or I don't know Groovy, I might go and ask the person that actually maintains this shared library, what is this doing? Can you walk me through this? But that's only if I'm curious about this. If I'm not super curious or I don't need to know this, I don't have to go digging in here. I can just accept that the pipeline is going to send some notifications, and I'm going to just use that, and it'll be okay. So that's one example. Let's look at a real-world example. This is the Mozillian tests. One of the and they use declarative pipeline with a shared library. So this one has has a little bit of Groovy at the top, just declaring a couple of variables that they need, and then goes right into, again, a pretty sensible shared library. I haven't actually looked at this in several months, so they've changed things around, but with, just again, I'm looking at this relatively concise pipeline. I can say, oh, they're using libraries, they're using this FX test library and this particular tag of it. So that way, if they make changes, this won't break, it'll stay stable. This is one of the features of shared libraries where you can say, okay, I'm going to create a tag, I'm going to use that tag until I decide that I want to try using another one. And so people can continue to develop those shared libraries separately and then pull them over when they feel like they're ready, when they release a new version. So this library uses some options, the ANSI color, so on and so forth. I'm going to sort of scoot along here. Again, this is, there's an agent. They're going to use a Docker file that's checked in alongside of this Jenkins file. They have some tests, again, still running an agent with a Docker file. Write capabilities. I don't know that one. I wonder where that came from. I bet that's from the shared library. So what else? I can go, so write capabilities, they're writing this JSON file probably with something from, okay, so here's the capabilities. So, and then they run a shell script, and then they have some post steps, and publish some results. Okay, this all makes basic sense. And there's also an IRC notification. I'm pretty sure that's not a step that's used in general, that's provided by some plugin. That's probably from the shared library as well. So Again, as a new person, if I were working on their team and I wanted to understand what their delivery process was, I can understand this. I can at least say, okay, they're doing some basic steps. They've actually made some nice, sensibly named methods, some sensibly named steps that I can sort of understand, but also not feel like I have to dig into if I don't feel like I need to. But if I do, they have this. They've included this FX text Jenkins pipeline on their Jenkins server, which points. So they've given it a name called FX test on their server. And that points here. And if I'm curious, I can go digging into what does IRC notification do? Well, it does this shell script. Interesting. Okay. What about these other things? So again, as a more technical person, I might be curious. As someone who is more just an end user of that delivery pipeline, I would say, okay, I don't need to dig into that. I'll go ask the person. If I need a new feature in there, I'll ask the person that maintains the shared library to add this feature or do some change or point out some problem. So, concerns. Obviously, this is, there are concerns around making your pipelines more concise. What about dry? What about don't repeat yourself? There isn't necessarily a single target for don't repeat yourself, right? Depending on your organization, you may need to make something shorter or longer. Declarative pipeline itself is a little more verbose, as we saw. There's ways to do your pipeline in one line, and that's fine, or do it in 5. Declarative pipeline forces you to have a somewhat more verbose structure. So in that sense, if you're looking for super short, it's not the way to go. And sometimes your organization may require that kind of behavior, or may require, but if possible, I would suggest trying to stick with declarative because it actually provides enough information without getting too expensive. Many of you, I'm sure, use more complex scenarios, things that don't fit into declarative, where you're trying to do some very large matrix of tests or builds, and declarative doesn't cover your cases. In those cases, one, I would suggest you definitely get on the Jenkins dev mailing list or on the Gitter channels and talk to the devs that are working on that, or look in the Jira database and make sure that we have your scenario on the list of things that are at least have been requested. In some cases, the response that will come back will be, well, what you're asking for is sort of outside the realm of declarative. But at least personally, I think, and speaking for some of the people that I know work on declarative, they're interested in covering the majority of scenarios. You will still find ones that are outside of that. But when possible, it's the only way that people working on declarative can know that there's a need is if you speak up and join in and contribute. And by contribute, I mean at least tell us what you need. So for those, but in the case that you can't use it or that the feature's not there, I suggest trying to continue to look for that balance point where you have enough information in your pipeline that anyone can understand it, but also not having so much code and complex code that people get lost. Another common question is about maintainability. When you have a somewhat more verbose structure or a somewhat more expressive structure like declarative, and you need to maintain it, that means that you may need to make changes in several places in the file instead of just one, because the declarative structure forces you to have a little bit more, a few more places where you say things where you can't just collapse them into one line. That is I would say a minor cost compared to making it harder for people to understand. This is the same reason why we don't put all of our code on one line. We're humans. We need to be able to read the code, not just the machine. And I guess the last point would be around validation. People have concerns around validating their pipelines. This is a common problem around requesting, like, I need to be able to debug my pipeline. I need to be able to look at these things more. So in that case, shared libraries are actually a big help because you can go and validate that code separate from your live pipeline. You can go and test that code. You can go and make sure that it works and is stable and does what you want, and then release that with its own versioning system that then people can pick up when they're ready. So recommendations, pretty straightforward. Use declarative pipelines. When possible, use shared libraries with declarative pipelines. There are ways to stuff scripted code into declarative, and I know a lot of people do this, and every time I see them do that, I go, use shared libraries. Don't force, you're sort of, by stuffing scripted code into declarative, you're sort of removing the advantage that you've just tried to gain for yourself. And finally, this is DevOps world. Democratize your continuous delivery process. Make it available and understandable to everyone on your team, from the people from your devs right through to ops and everyone in between, managers, testers, everyone. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
For shared libraries, do you support any other languages other than Groovy, or it has to be only shared languages?
The question was, do we support any other languages than Groovy? I don't believe that we do. So that's the way that you have to do this. Now, I will say that within shared libraries, you can import, you can include Java libraries or anything else that you could call from Java. So if you have another library that is compatible with the JVM, you could call it from that shared library by importing it. If that's your desire, but you'd still have, the way I understand the functionality, you would still have to have that shared library as a thin wrapper around that functionality. Yes?
Why is scripted pipeline 64K limit? It just seems really
Woo! Why is scripted pipeline what is that, a 64K limit? Mm-hmm. Is that per file?
Yes.
I don't know.
It seems stupid.
You have stumped me. Come by the experts booth. Talk with Sam about that. Sam and Van Ort would know. Maybe it's to force you to use shared libraries. Well, you've passed the limit. It's time to start making methods in a separate file. Yes.
This may already be the case, but just declarative.
Sorry. I meant down here. You'll be next. Promise.
Does declarative pipeline have any plans to support dynamic parallel tasks?
So the question is, does declarative pipeline have plans to support dynamic parallel tasks? Yeah, now I can, and by that, so tell me if I've got this right. So for instance, I have a suite of 1,000 tests, and I just want it to just divide those tests across 10 machines, and split that across these three configurations, and go, right? And then give me a stage for each one of those, right? So that I could actually watch each of them work. That is a harder problem. I don't believe there's a plan for that, but again, this is that participate, please. File that. I know that there's been work on doing a matrix step, but it's not done, which would get closer to what you're looking at. Again, this would be where I would go with a shared library, where you say, okay, but that wouldn't address the need for having a stage for each one of those things or something like that. There's space in here for improvement, definitely, and this is a really, by the way, I was like, yes, I know exactly where you're going. It's one of the things that I've asked for 2 years now. But The point being is, with that amount of demand, I would hope that people could get together and figure out how to contribute that. Because honestly, there's 2 or 3 people that at CloudBees in specific that work on declarative at most. So anyone that wants this, please come help. Yes, so you were next. Yes, sorry. Okay, so your question is there any reason why I can't have those groovy scripts in the shared library execute a shell script? No, definitely do that. Yeah, actually, so I could. Sorry. Say it again.
For the dynamic parallel stages, you have a prebuilt step that generates the Jenkins file according to parameters. Then essentially that prebuilt step, then it's not dynamic. You've actually generated the Jenkins file with the stages you want. So that's a solution.
So okay, so you've provided an answer to the previous question, which is, but let me. I will repeat your answer, and then I will suggest why I would suggest not doing that. His answer to your wanting to dynamically generate your branches is to dynamically generate the Jenkins file as a whole, right? And the problem with that is then you're back in that space of you're creating something that, well, two possibilities. One is you generate it on the fly and you don't check it in, right? And that means that the only way that someone can see that is by actually running that generation and then looking at it there. But that generation is now, it's not magic, it's code, but compared to declarative and having that structure, it's magic. And yeah, fair. There's a workaround. Okay, I'm sorry. This is you and I should talk after. I don't know where. I would like to continue on with some shorter questions. It sounds like there's a lot of detail here that I'm not going to be able to repeat. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. You and I should definitely talk afterwards. I'm not getting what you're pointing out. So he's looking for a templatized Jenkins file, or some way of overriding specific things. I'm not sure. I mean, like the other thing that you could do is if you wanted. So another thing you could do. I think I'm not sure where your question exactly went, but you could have. Here's our set of stages, and you have a set of steps that you have a shared library for, and then each team could have its own version of that shared library, for example, that performs specific functions. No. Okay, let's move on. That's correct. So the comment is that there's no way to put declarative inside of a shared library, right? Or just like have a stage have it say, I want this stage to be part of the shared library. Right. Right. So the question is there any work being done to add that in? And I believe that there was work done to basically say that you could put the entire pipeline into a shared library. But that's, yeah. The problem there is, again, we go back to the other direction of, okay, now you've made it harder for someone who's looking at that declarative pipeline in that Jenkins file to understand where your stages are and what they look like. I don't think there's work being done in that area, but again, that's something that you should definitely make sure is in the JIRA and is in, at least being discussed. So you've had your hand up the whole time. You're like, please. Yes. Thank you. The question is, do I have any recommendation for testing shared libraries? Use branches. Everyone wants to be able to debug. Everyone wants to be able to test these things. It is I admit it is a problem, and it is not a smooth path there. However, having a shared library, and there's a couple ways. There's actually a Jenkins File runner that lets you run things locally outside of a Jenkins server, so you could just run things right there. There's I'm trying to remember. There's a Jenkins File. There's a unit testing. Pipeline unit testing? Okay. Yeah, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's basically, it lets you mock out the responses from various steps. That lets you test the pipeline, not necessarily the shared library. So this is the other side of that. And for those, though, I would say, do you have an answer, or do you have other questions? You. What? Okay, you have an answer. You can say what?
You can test Jenkins files and shared library code
With
with Spock.
Spock.
Natively, nothing special, just write Spock it works.
Okay. Spock.
What's Spock?
What is Spock? Yes, tell it.
It's a framework for unit testing Ruby.
Okay, Spock is a framework for unit testing Groovy, and you can use it for pipeline and shared libraries, looks like. I'll be one of SPOCK? Was that? Oh, and there's a talk on it here. Is it coming up? 11:15. That's why you were saying 11:15. So right after this, you can go find out how to do that. Excellent. We're solving this together. See, democratizing. It's fantastic. Yes. Oh, okay. Sorry. Speak a little louder. Oh. So this is a culture question. How do you, a mix of culture and technology here, how would I encourage people, teams that have gone down the direction of using scripted pipeline to switch to declarative? So this is a hard problem because it's a culture problem, right? That people have invested a lot of time and effort into making. Usually with the scripted pipelines, they will either be really long pipelines, long Jenkins files, or they'll be really short Jenkins files that have used shared libraries. Okay, so there's two things there. They're long and the performance is terrible. I'm going to come to this side of the room next, FYI, for questions. I promise. I've gone over here because I can actually, you're in the dark. So, for long ones, that they're all in one piece, that's great. Because what you can do is say, great, you can already see it's all in one spot. Here's everything. You get them to move those things into shared libraries. And like, okay, so you have all this code. Create some methods, break this up into pieces that make more sense. And as they do that, it will generally fall out, or you can guide them as they do that to say, but don't put stages in anything that requires complex logic or stages. Don't put that into a method, right? So you can sort of guide them in this direction. And once they have those methods available and they've done sort of the beginning, that initial work, it generally begins to fall out if declarative is an option, right? They may have some complex cases that don't work in declarative, in which case you're stuck. Or there's a point where you have to stop. But if it turns out that really what they have is, okay, we have some complex logic, but it doesn't require a stage, et cetera. Like there's a point at which it'll become pretty clear whether or not what they have at that point maps to declarative. And that's when you can say, hey, you can use declarative for this. That's the way I'd go with that. Let me go over here first. Anyone over here? Yes. Yes, you.
Our share library actually looks very much like the example
Yeah.
to start with. Then we get into the branching stuff. Like if master do this, if integration do that.
Right.
And it soon becomes complicated again.
You mean the Jenkins file or the shared library?
The Jenkins file,
Okay.
do you have the recommendation on that? It's just a lot of when.
Right. So declarative limits your ability to do loops and limits your ability to have branching and if statements and complex logic. This is by design. However, it does have some degree of branching allowed and flow control. I don't know if I have an example of it sitting right here, but basically on your stages you can put a when clause that will make the stage run or not run depending on some case, such as what branch you're on and so on and so forth. And the question is, then you end up with this really complex logic again. It doesn't really help you. Design-wise, I know why they did that, and there are cases where it makes sense. I think there's a certain point when you're doing that logic, you need to start asking yourself, shouldn't this be in a shared library? If I'm doing a bunch of really complex if statements, and as an example, if after test here, many pipelines will have a deploy step, right? In one example, you would have deploy to staging, deploy to dev, deploy to staging, and deploy to production. And you'd have each of those stages and then a when clause on each of those stages that says which, like, if I'm on master, then I will deploy to production or I will deploy to staging. And then I will have an input step that waits for some information or some approval before I deploy to production, for example. You have a bunch of when and inputs and more complex logic. But you'll always deploy to dev, for example. So then you have this more complex stage structure. Maybe the right choice there is to actually say deploy, have a deploy stage, and have a shared library that has that complex logic in it that includes, hey, what's the branch? Do we need approval? If so, then do that, right? So that would be where there's a balancing point where when you start to get more complex when structures in there, I would start looking at whether or not you can move that behavior into a shared library. Yes? Yeah, you'll end up, in that case, you'll end up with if statements inside the shared library. Yeah, you'll still have the logic still exists, but you move to this sort of concise structure where you say, well, I'm going to do these major blocks, these stages, and then and sort of abstract away some of the complexity. One more from over here. Yeah?
So if us as a team working on a particular product have agreed to create certain shared libraries to automate redundant tasks, is there a way we can enforce the use of this without someone going rogue and doing kind of their own thing and destroying what we all agreed upon?
So the question is, what about policy enforcement? We have a team. This team has created a set of shared libraries, and we want everyone to use them. But how do we make sure that they use them and don't just go do whatever the heck they want? In basic declarative, that is not a scenario that we are concerned with. It's like, if you need to enforce stuff, that is something, and I'm not trying to sell people on this, I'm saying that's a point. That level of enforcement stuff, that's you'll want to talk to Cloud Bees about that kind of thing. That's the enterprise level stuff where you're trying to do where you're trying to enforce certain things and trying to have organizational control. Fair? Okay. However, as long as people use that, the flip side of this is you could also just say, hey, we have a code review process. If you don't have this library at the top, we're not gonna let you check in. So there's also the flip side of just having people sort of bring each other along, right? All right, back to the middle, yes?
I have a very basic question. How do we use the shared library? In the sense, I see there is a GitHub URL.
Mm-hmm.
Do I fork it into my own project Git repo and use it? Or, I mean, if there is a community out there which is always updating this GitHub repo, so how do I get the latest and greatest if I fork into my own project?
So the question is, how do we use shared libraries? If I see this shared library, how do I pull it in? How do I get the latest and greatest? If I fork it on GitHub, then what do I do here? I'm gonna punt that one. I'm sorry. There's actually I'm gonna direct you to the documentation for that. Whether or not you fork is a choice that you make. I will say that when you set up your shared library on your Jenkins master, you'll point it to a particular repository, and then you can control what the default branch that you use in that repository is if you don't specify a commit or a commit-ish, that @ sign. There it is. So for instance, in the Mozillian test thing here, they have a libraries, they point to this fxtest shared library, and they point to a specific tag that they've created in that library. And the neat thing about this that I really like is that means that they version that means that I can tell from looking at this, they version their shared library. They release actual version. They say, okay, here's a 1.10, 1.11, et cetera, so on and so forth. And they can continue to work on that. Someone could go in and create PRs and test and do work there with guaranteed not breaking this pipeline, because this pipeline is using specifically that version, right?
How are you using it? Are you into the main GitHub repo?
Yeah, well, so in this case, this is using it by pointing to the main GitHub repo. Yeah, they don't need. Yes, you wouldn't. I'm almost out of time here, I think. So to close, if you were wanting to make changes and you wanted to test that, there you go. Yes, you could actually change that to fork to point to your own GitHub repo. You'd have to do a bit of work to make that happen, but it's interesting that you could actually do this. Yeah. All right. Is another one short question? You seem very intent. Yes. Short question. What is the policy, or just does it? The question is, can you call shared libraries from other shared libraries? I wouldn't do that. I would say that if you had something that you wanted to do that with, that would be something where you go all the way to creating a library, an actual like Java, jar that you could import. And I think that at this point we're out of time. Yep. So thank you all very much. And enjoy the rest of the conference.